Before dawn, on the edge of the Palos Preserves, Eli Carter, a homeless 12-year-old, freezes behind a thicket as two men drag an unconscious stranger toward a freshly dug pit. When the fog thins, Eli recognizes the face. Silas Ror, the boss people in the city only whisper about. One man chuckles. Hurry. His people will not get here in time. Eli's blood turns cold because that only makes sense if someone had compromised the rescue from the inside. A shovel hits wet earth. Thump thump. Like a countdown. Silas twitches. Steel gray eyes crack open and lock onto Eli's hiding place. Half command, half plea. Don't let me die here. No phone. No adults. Just a stone by an oak and a choice. Eli throws the stone. The men spin around. He lunges, drags Silas back from the edge, and runs. Minutes later, he stumbles onto the road, waving down cars that blaze past until a dark SUV brakes hard. The window drops. The driver's stare isn't panicked. It's controlled. Eli gasps. They are burying Silas Ror alive. And the driver's expression shifts like he just realized the hunt has begun. The man did not waste a single second on disbelief. He reached across the console and shoved the heavy passenger door open. "Show me," was the only command he barked. Eli threw his shivering, mud-soaked body into the luxurious leather back seat, barely pulling his legs inside before the tires shrieked. Miles twisted the heavy steering wheel with brutal precision, turning the vehicle into a weapon. The dark SUV tore completely off the asphalt and crashed blindly into the dense brush of the Palos Preserves like a steel battering ram. Branches whipped against the windshield and shattered the morning fog as the vehicle plunged toward the tree-line. The two hitmen had already scattered into the woods at the sound of the roaring engine and the crushing of timber. Miles skidded the truck to a violent halt near the freshly dug pit and leapt from the driver's seat. He moved with the cold efficiency of a soldier who had spent his entire life cleaning up blood. He hauled Silas from the freezing mud and dragged his boss's heavy, battered body into the passenger side. Silas was breathing, but barely conscious, and his expensive coat was ruined with wet earth. Miles threw the vehicle into reverse and tore back onto the desolate road toward the city. He pressed a concealed button under the dashboard to open a silent, encrypted communication channel to the Chicago safe house. The ride was suffocatingly quiet, and Eli curled his shivering frame against the leather door while the city skyline slowly pierced the gray horizon. The SUV did not head toward a hospital because men like Silas Ror could not afford to be vulnerable in public. They bypassed the glittering downtown and descended into a heavily fortified private estate hidden behind 30-foot stone walls in the wealthiest district. Massive iron gates rolled open automatically without a single squeal of metal and snapped shut the moment the rear bumper cleared the threshold. The vehicle descended into a subterranean garage bathed in harsh white light and swarming with heavily armed men in black tactical gear. Eli shrank back against the leather seat because this place felt more like a military bunker than a home. The doors opened and the guards moved in perfect synchronization to extract Silas without speaking a single word of panic. A man with an assault rifle slung across his chest reached for Eli with rough hands and barked a command to get out. The boy stumbled onto the polished concrete, and his muddy sneakers left dirty footprints in a world where everything was sterile and unforgiving. He was thrust into a terrifying fortress of gleaming marble corridors and security cameras that tracked his every flinch. Eli realized he had not just saved a man from a grave, but he had stepped inside a cage where the monsters were rich and untouchable. Then the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall swung open and Harper Lane Ror stepped out of the shadows. She was 26 years old and carried the chilling authority of a queen, but her eyes held a storm that the polished marble could not reflect. Harper did not scream or break down when she saw her husband bleeding and covered in mud being rushed toward the underground medical wing. She simply nodded to the guards, and her gaze calculated every detail with the survival instinct of a cornered animal. Harper knew the scent of desperation because she had not been born into this glittering empire of violence and wealth. Just 5 years ago, she was a destitute street kid drowning in $1,500,000 of inherited medical debt and sleeping in subway cars. Silas had pulled her from the gutter and shielded her from the brutal collectors, and she had sworn to burn the world down to protect him in return. The guards stepped aside immediately because they knew the boss's wife was just as lethal as the men holding the guns. She scanned the chaotic room and her sharp eyes suddenly dropped and locked onto the small, shivering figure backed against the cold wall. Eli looked up at Harper with hollow, terrified eyes, and his thin shoulders trembled violently under his soaked and ruined jacket. In that split second, the cold Mafia wife vanished and the phantom of the hungry, invisible street kid she used to be clawed its way to the surface. She saw the mud caked deep under his fingernails and recognized the distinct, hyper-vigilant stare of a child who expected every adult to strike him. One of the armed guards stepped toward Eli and raised his hand to forcefully search the boy for hidden tracking devices. Harper moved faster than a breath and placed her body directly between the towering mercenary and the trembling 12-year-old. "Do not touch him," she ordered, and her voice was a quiet, razor-sharp command that made the entire hallway freeze in absolute silence. She dropped to her knees on the pristine marble floor, completely ignoring the wet mud that instantly stained her expensive dark silk trousers. Harper reached out with slow, empty hands so she would not startle him, and she gently wrapped her warm coat around Eli's freezing shoulders. "You are safe now," she whispered to him, her voice fiercely tender and absolute. The boy stared at her in disbelief, but for the first time in his life, he felt the heavy, crushing weight of being truly protected. Deep beneath the marble floors of the Chicago safe house, the air smelled of bleach and iron. The syndicate's underground trauma surgeon worked in absolute silence over Silas Ror. There were no sirens and no frantic nurses in this pristine white room. Just the steady hum of medical machines keeping the most dangerous man in the city alive. Miles stood guard by the steel door with his posture rigid and his eyes unblinking. The surgeon stepped back and dropped a tiny, bloodied piece of metal into a stainless steel basin. It was not a bullet. Miles stared at the ruined microchip and felt a cold knot pull tight in his stomach. It was Silas's encrypted subdermal tracking device. The removal was a flawless surgical job and not a messy street slashing. That meant the hit was not a random ambush by a rival crew. The assassination had been orchestrated by a high-level insider who knew exactly where to cut. Upstairs in the guest wing, the atmosphere was just as volatile. 3 heavily armed guards stood outside the oak doors, their hands resting too closely to their holstered weapons. They viewed the muddy 12-year-old boy as a potential spy who had somehow slipped past their billion-dollar security net. Harper Lane Roar stepped into the hallway and her presence immediately sucked the air out of the space. She did not raise her voice, but her glare was lethal enough to make the seasoned mercenaries step back. "You will lower your hands and you will step away from that door," Harper commanded. The lead guard opened his mouth to argue about protocol, but Harper cut him off with a chilling look. She told them they were looking at a traumatized child and not a cartel assassin. Harper ordered them to stand down and threatened to bury anyone who made the boy feel like a prisoner. The men swallowed their pride and obeyed, because everyone knew Silas built this empire, but Harper possessed the terrifying power to tear it down. Harper pushed open the heavy door and found Eli sitting in the far corner of the massive room. He was bathed in warm water and dressed in clean clothes, but his knees were still pulled tight against his chest. His eyes darted toward the door the second she entered, tracking her every movement with severe hypervigilance. Harper recognized that look instantly because she had worn it for years while surviving the brutal Chicago winters on her own. She did not walk toward him quickly or offer empty promises about everything being fine. Instead, she sat on the edge of the velvet sofa and kept her distance so he could breathe. She spoke softly and told him she knew exactly what it felt like to be invisible and terrified. Eli watched her carefully, searching for the lie that adults always told before they hurt him. But Harper only offered him a quiet truth and a warm bowl of soup, refusing to pressure him into speaking. In that silent standoff, an unspoken bond formed between the former street kid and the broken boy who had just saved her world. The fragile quiet of the safe house shattered when Miles sent a single, coded pulse to Harper's phone. Silas was awake. Harper left Eli with a gentle promise to return and hurried down to the underground medical bay. Silas lay on the pristine bed, pale and bruised, but his steel-gray eyes burned with a cold, calculating fury. He did not ask about his injuries or complain about the pain tearing through his ribs. Miles stepped forward and delivered the chilling report about the surgically removed tracking device. Silas absorbed the news without a single flinch, radiating a terrifying calm that made the entire room feel 10 degrees colder. He understood immediately that the enemy was sitting at his own table and eating from his own plate. Silas looked at his loyal driver and issued his first command since rising from the grave. Initiate a total blackout of every communication channel in the Chicago syndicate, Silas ordered. No calls, no encrypted messages, and no external contact would be permitted under penalty of death. The boss was locking the doors from the inside, and the hunt for the traitor had officially begun. The lockdown of the Chicago safe house was absolute, but blood still held the keys to the heaviest doors. Silas Ror glided past the outer perimeter guards with the effortless grace of a man who owned the very ground they walked on. He was Silas's uncle, and he wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than most cars. His silver hair was perfectly swept back, and his smile was as smooth as velvet over crushed glass. The heavy oak doors of the guest wing swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cyrus did not look like a cartel boss or a street thug. He looked like an aristocrat coming to check on his wounded nephew, but his dark eyes swept the room with the predatory calculation of a starving wolf. He spotted Harper sitting near the fireplace, and then his gaze locked onto the small 12-year-old boy curled up on the sofa. Cyrus stepped forward with his hands open and a pristine wrapped box extended like an olive branch. He was the enemy disguised as family, and the hunt had just walked through the front door. Eli pressed his back against the expensive leather cushions and his breath hitched in his throat. Cyrus knelt slowly so he would be at eye level with the terrified boy, and he placed the immaculate silver gift box on the glass coffee table. "I heard we have a little hero in the house," Cyrus murmured, and his voice was rich and warm like poisoned honey. He reached out and patted Eli on the knee, but his fingers pressed just a fraction too hard into the bone. Eli shrank away from the touch because he recognized the quiet cruelty hiding behind the expensive cologne. Cyrus tilted his head and asked exactly how dark it was in the Palos Preserves that morning. He asked if the fog was too thick to see the faces of the bad men who hurt his nephew. The question sounded like genuine concern to an untrained ear, but they were a brutal, calculated interrogation to measure a witness. Cyrus wanted to know if the boy could put a name to the hitmen who dug the grave. He smiled with perfectly white teeth and told Eli that little boys who see too much often get lost in the dark. Harper felt the venom in those words, and her protective instincts flared into a quiet rage. She did not scream or draw the concealed weapon strapped to her thigh, because starting a war in the living room would only sign Eli's death warrant. Instead, she stepped smoothly between the predator and his prey with a flawless, icy smile. He was entirely blinded by the fog, Uncle Cyrus, Harper said, and she kept her voice perfectly level to match his aristocratic tone. She placed her hand firmly on Eli's shoulder and pulled the boy slightly behind her own body. Harper explained that the trauma had clouded the child's memory and that the police would find nothing useful in his testimony. Cyrus stood up slowly and adjusted his silk tie while he evaluated the fierce street kid who had married into his royal bloodline. He knew she was lying and she knew he was digging, but the fragile rules of the Mafia family demanded they play this lethal game of chess with polite smiles. Cyrus gave a short nod of fake sympathy and advised Harper to keep the boy very close before he turned and walked out the heavy oak doors. The velvet threat lingered in the air long after the scent of his cologne had faded from the room. The second the massive doors clicked shut, Harper left Eli with Miles and descended the marble staircase into the underground medical bay. Silas was sitting up in his bed with his ribs heavily bandaged and his laptop glowing in the dim light. Harper recounted every word of the interrogation, and she watched her husband's steel-gray eyes darken with absolute certainty. They both understood that Cyrus did not care about family loyalty or finding the men who dug the pit. Cyrus was plotting a hostile takeover to seize the Chicago syndicate and claim the $1,500 million master ledger. That ledger controlled every offshore account and every dirty politician in the state, and Silas was the only man holding the keys. Silas closed his laptop with a quiet snap and looked at his wife with a cold, terrifying resolve. They realized Cyrus had just confirmed his own treason by coming to the safe house to measure the boy. Eli was no longer just a rescued child or a random bystander in a mafia war. The boy was a loose end that the most dangerous man in Chicago needed to permanently sever, and the true battle for his life had just begun. The billion-dollar security system of the Chicago safe house was supposed to be impenetrable. Cameras covered every inch of the perimeter and armed guards patrolled the iron gates without blinking. But betrayal does not need to climb a wall when it already has a key. Harper walked into the main study and stopped dead in her tracks. A pristine white envelope sat perfectly centered on the massive mahogany table. There were no fingerprints and no courier logs to explain how it had materialized inside the most secure room in the city. The paper felt heavy and cold in her hands as she tore it open. She pulled out a glossy surveillance photograph, and her blood instantly turned to ice. It was a picture of Eli standing in the muddy fog of the Palos Preserves. Someone had drawn a jagged red target directly over the child's terrified face. Beneath the photo was a single line of printed text that carried the weight of a death sentence. It demanded the hand over the master ledger or the boy dies. Harper did not scream, but her breathing turned shallow and fast. She carried the poison letter down to the underground medical bay where Silas was still recovering. Silas looked at the photograph and his steel-gray eyes darkened into a terrifying abyss. He knew this was Cyrus tightening the noose and proving that no fortress could protect them from family. Harper's voice trembled slightly as she asked how they could possibly keep the boy safe when the enemy was already inside their walls. Silas answered with a cold and absolute vow that he would burn his own empire to the ground before he handed a child over to the wolves. Neither of them realized the heavy oak door had not latched completely shut. Eli stood in the dark hallway with his bare feet pressed against the cold marble floor. He had crept out of bed for a glass of water, and instead, he found his own execution warrant. He pressed his hands over his mouth to muffle his terrified gasps as he listened to the only people who had ever shown him kindness discussing the deadly price of his life. The words hit Eli harder than any fist he had ever taken on the streets. He backed away from the door and retreated to the guest wing like a ghost. His small chest heaved as panic and toxic guilt flooded his veins. Eli had spent his entire 12 years of life believing he was a burden and a curse. Every time someone tried to care for him, they ended up broken or bleeding or gone. He looked around the beautiful and warm room that Harper had given him, and he felt like a thief who had stolen a piece of heaven. He knew Cyrus would not stop hunting, and that the red target on his face would eventually bleed onto Harper and Silas. If he stayed in this house, they would be forced to choose between their power and his life. Eli decided he could not let the first woman who ever looked at him with a mother's love die because of his bad luck. The choice was agonizing, but it was the only math a street kid understood. He had to subtract himself from the equation to save the people he cared about. Eli ignored the new clothes folded neatly in the dresser and reached for his old street jacket. The worn fabric still smelled like damp cardboard and cold alleyways, but it felt like the only skin he truly deserved. He pulled the zipper up to his chin and quietly unlatched the heavy brass lock on the guest room window. The Chicago wind immediately lashed against his face like a whip made of freezing needles. The security system was designed to keep heavily armed men out of the compound, but it was not calibrated to stop a tiny starving boy from slipping through the narrowest gaps. Eli squeezed his thin frame through the window frame and dropped silently onto the frosted grass below. He did not look back at the warm golden light spilling from the house because he knew it would break his fragile resolve. He sprinted toward the tree lean and scrambled over the outer stone wall with the desperate agility of a stray dog. The freezing Chicago night swallowed him whole as he ran back into the brutal world he had just escaped, hoping his disappearance would take the crosshairs with him. Harper walked back up the marble stairs and immediately sensed the unnatural silence bleeding from the guest wing. She pushed open the heavy oak doors and found the bed empty and the window unlatched. The freezing Chicago wind tore through the curtains like a chilling warning. Harper did not scream for the guards, and she did not wait for Miles to authorize a search party. She knew the brutal math of the streets better than anyone in this fortress. A child running into the freezing night was a child stepping onto a battlefield without his shield. She ignored the strict lockdown protocol and threw herself out the back exit into the icy darkness. The frost crunched beneath her boots as she tracked his small and panicked footprints across the frozen grass. She followed the desperate trail over the stone wall and down toward the desolate service road bordering the estate. Her chest burned with the freezing air, but she refused to stop running. She spotted his thin silhouette shivering under a broken street lamp at the edge of the asphalt. Eli had stopped running because his small body simply could not fight the freezing temperature anymore. Harper slowed her pace and approached him with her hands open and empty so she would not startle him. She did not yell, and she did not scold him for breaking the rules of the safe house. She looked into his terrified eyes and begged him to understand that he was never a burden to her. She told him that adults who use children as bargaining chips are the real monsters, and they would fight them together. Eli took a hesitant step toward her outstretched hand, and a tiny spark of hope finally broke through his toxic guilt. But that fragile spark was violently snuffed out before his fingers could even touch her palm. High beams suddenly flooded the dark service road and blinded them both in a wash of harsh white light. Two black vans screeched to a violent halt on the freezing asphalt and trapped them against the tree line. The doors slid open and 10 heavily armed mercenaries poured out into the night. These were not random street thugs, but Grant Harlow's highly trained enforcers moving with lethal precision. Harper did not freeze and she did not surrender. She threw herself entirely over Eli and transformed her own body into a human shield. The first mercenary lunged forward and Harper met him with a vicious strike that shattered his jaw with a sickening crack. She fought like a cornered animal and traded brutal blows with men twice her size in the freezing mud. But the numbers were simply too great, and a heavy rifle but slammed into the back of her head. The impact dropped her to her knees, and the world spun into a dizzying blur of blood and snow. Rough hands tore Eli from her grasp, and the boy screamed her name as they dragged him into the waiting van. The heavy doors slammed shut, and the vehicles vanished into the Chicago night like phantoms. Harper knelt alone on the freezing asphalt, and her hands scraped desperately against the empty tire tracks. The silence of the service road rushed back in, and it felt heavier than a grave. She dragged her battered body back to the safe house, and blood dripped from her temple onto the pristine marble floors. She bypassed the shocked guards and walked straight into the underground medical bay where Silas was issuing orders. Silas took one look at his bleeding wife, and the empty space beside her and the temperature in the room plummeted. Harper did not cry, and she did not tremble. She looked her husband in the eye and delivered the devastating news. "Grant took our boy," she whispered. Silas stood up slowly, and his steel-gray eyes burned with a terrifying and apocalyptic rage. He swore to burn the entire city of Chicago to the ground and sift through the ashes to bring their son home. Silas did not scream or throw glass against the wall when his son was taken. He turned into a machine made of ice and calculated violence. He stood in the center of the underground medical bay and activated a shadow network that had ruled Chicago for decades. Miles stood beside him and transmitted a silent pulse to every informant, street dealer, and corrupt dock worker on their payroll. They did not need police scanners or helicopters to find the two black vans. The eyes and ears of the syndicate watched the vehicles tear through the city and disappear into the labyrinth of the meatpacking district. Every turn and every stop was silently reported back to the safe house in real time. Silas watched the coordinates blink on the massive digital map, and his jaw locked tight enough to shatter teeth. He knew exactly where they were taking Eli, but he also knew that charging in blindly was exactly what the enemy wanted. Harper's phone buzzed with a harsh and metallic vibration that shattered the tense silence of the room. It was an encrypted text from an untraceable burner number demanding she come alone to an abandoned meat processing warehouse on the west side. The message promised that if Silas brought his army, the boy would be executed before they even breached the heavy steel doors. Harper gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white, but Silas placed a heavy, steadying hand over hers. He looked at the coordinates and his brilliant, lethal mind instantly disassembled the entire plot. Grant Harlow was not a desperate thug making a simple ransom demand. He was a calculated traitor setting a sophisticated public relations trap for a king. Silas explained that Cyrus and Grant had rigged the entire warehouse with hidden cameras, waiting for him to arrive with guns blazing. They wanted to capture the feared Mafia boss committing a bloodbath so they could hand the footage to the federal authorities and legally usurp his throne. A lesser man would have let rage dictate his next move and marched into the slaughterhouse to tear Grant apart with his bare hands. But Silas Ror had built his empire by outsmarting predators, not by wrestling with them in the mud. He reached for a secured landline and dialed a number that no Mafia boss was ever supposed to call. Detective Aaron Holt answered the phone with the exhausted and cynical tone of a clean cop who had spent his whole life fighting a losing war. Holt hated the syndicate, but he valued airtight evidence and absolute justice over pointless street violence. Silas laid out the entire extortion plot and offered the detective the career-defining arrest of Silas Ror and Grant Harlow on a silver platter. He promised there would be no Mafia hitmen and no illegal blood spilled in the warehouse tonight. Holt listened to the cold truth in Silas's voice and agreed to mobilize a covert tactical unit to secure the perimeter legally. The plan required a flawless execution and a bait that Grant would genuinely believe he could control. Harper stood up from the medical cot and wiped the dried blood from her bruised temple with a steady hand. She looked at Silas and Detective Holt and declared her intention. "I am walking into that warehouse alone," Harper said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a queen. Holt immediately objected, warning her that Grant's mercenaries would not hesitate to kill her the second things went wrong. But Harper possessed the fierce, unbreakable spirit of a mother who had already lost everything once. She told the cynical detective that Grant expected a terrified wife begging for a child, and she was going to give him exactly that performance. She demanded Holt tape a concealed police wire to her ribs and record every single word of the extortion. Silas looked at his wife, and his chest tightened with a terrifying mixture of agonizing fear and profound awe. He nodded his head slowly, sealing the dangerous pact, and Harper prepared to walk back into the freezing dark to bring their son home. The abandoned meat processing warehouse loomed in the Chicago night like a rotting iron beast. The freezing wind howled through the shattered high windows and carried the metallic stench of old blood and rust. Harper Lane Roar stepped out of her vehicle and walked toward the heavy steel doors completely alone. The concealed police microphone was taped tightly against her bruised ribs. Every step she took echoed across the cracked concrete like a ticking clock. She pushed the rusted doors open, and the harsh glare of industrial halogen lights blinded her for a fraction of a second. As her eyes adjusted, she saw him. Eli was zip-tied to a metal chair in the dead center of the massive slaughterhouse floor. His thin body was trembling uncontrollably and his face was pale with sheer terror. 10 heavily armed mercenaries formed a lethal circle around the 12-year-old boy. And stepping out from the shadows with a perfectly tailored suit and a smug smile was Grant Harlow. The traitor looked at the bruised and bleeding woman walking into his trap, and he mistakenly believed he had already won the war. Grant did not look at Harper with respect. His eyes darted past her shoulders and pierced into the darkness outside the warehouse doors. He was searching for the monster. He expected Silas Ror to burst through the entrance with a small army of hitmen raining bullets and fury. Grant had carefully positioned microscopic high-definition cameras in every corner of the ceiling to capture the bloodbath. He wanted the world to see the feared Mafia boss slaughtering men so Cyrus could legally seize the throne. "Where is your husband?" Grant asked, and his voice echoed against the concrete walls with a mocking edge. Harper stopped 10 feet away from the metal chair and forced her hands to shake. She did not have to act hard to channel the terror of a mother watching her child suffer. She looked at Eli and swallowed a dry sob, perfectly playing the role of a shattered and desperate wife. She begged Grant to let the boy go and promised that Silas was not coming. Grant laughed, and the sound was cold and hollow. He told her that Silas was a coward for sending a woman to negotiate for a stolen life. Harper needed him to keep talking, and she needed his arrogance to blind his logic. She kept her eyes glued to Eli and took a small, hesitant step forward. "We will give you whatever you want," Harper cried, letting the panic bleed into her voice. "Just tell me what it takes to buy his life back." Grant smiled and stepped closer to the trembling boy, resting his heavy hand on Eli's small shoulder. The gesture made Harper's blood boil, but she forced herself to stay perfectly still. Grant looked directly into the lens of a hidden camera and delivered his terms with absolute arrogance. He stated clearly that he and Cyrus orchestrated the kidnapping of the boy to force Silas to hand over the master ledger. He bragged about the surgical removal of the tracking device and the ambush in the Palos Preserves. Grant detailed the entire extortion plot out loud because he believed he was untouchable and writing his own victory speech. Every single word was transmitted perfectly through the wire taped to Harper's ribs and recorded by Detective Aaron Holt in a command van 2 miles away. The brilliant and deadly trap had just snapped shut around the traitor's throat. While Grant monologued under the harsh halogen lights, the shadows of the warehouse were coming alive. Miles and an elite tactical unit of Silas's most disciplined men were already inside the building. They moved with the terrifying and absolute silence of phantoms walking through a graveyard. Silas had given them one absolute command before they deployed into the night. There would be no fatal gunshots and no explosive violence to feed the hidden cameras. The perimeter guards stationed at the loading docks did not even have time to unholster their weapons. Miles stepped from the darkness and neutralized a heavy mercenary with a flawless chokehold that dropped the man into a silent sleep. The tactical team utilized stun batons and precise martial strikes to dismantle Grant's outer defenses without spilling a single drop of blood. They moved through the catwalks and the meat lockers with military perfection. The cameras only recorded empty hallways as the syndicate ghosts systematically dismantled the trap from the outside in. Inside the main room, Grant was just finishing his arrogant demand when the industrial lights suddenly died. Plunged into absolute and suffocating darkness, the remaining mercenaries shouted in panicked confusion. The sound of heavy boots hitting the concrete was immediately followed by the crackle of high-voltage stun batons. Harper did not hesitate or flinch in the blackness. She dropped to the floor and scrambled toward the center of the room by memory alone. Heavy bodies slammed into the metal equipment and weapons clattered uselessly onto the ground. Miles materialized out of the chaos and his combat knife sliced through the thick plastic zip ties binding Eli to the chair. Harper grabbed the boy and pulled him tightly against her chest, shielding his head from the violence exploding around them. When the backup emergency lights finally flickered to life a few seconds later, the warehouse floor was littered with groaning, incapacitated mercenaries. There were no bullet holes and no dead bodies for the cameras to exploit. Grant Harlow stood near the rear exit, and his smug confidence shattered into absolute terror. He realized he had been completely outplayed by a ghost. Grant turned and fled into the freezing Chicago night like a coward, but Silas did not care. Harper held her shivering boy and knew the physical war was over because the legal trap was now perfectly set. The physical war ended in the dark warehouse, but Silas Ror was too smart to surrender after one lost battle. He understood that when bullets fail to kill a king, the only weapon left is public perception. The next morning brought a new kind of nightmare into the heavily guarded Chicago safe house. The massive flat-screen television in the main living room lit up with breaking news across every local channel. Silas and Harper stood side by side and watched the screen as a ghost from Eli's brutal past was resurrected for the cameras. It was Travis Carter. He was Eli's abusive biological father, a man who had not cared if his son starved in an alleyway for the last 3 years. But today Travis wore a perfectly ironed suit and sat under the bright studio lights. He looked straight into the camera and wept with the flawless precision of a paid actor. The trap had shifted from an abandoned slaughterhouse to the ruthless arena of public opinion. Travis Carter did not stumble over his words or look nervous on national television. He was heavily coached and generously funded by Cyrus's most expensive corporate lawyers. He clutched an old, wrinkled photograph of Eli to his chest and let exactly 2 tears roll down his cheeks on cue. He told the greedy reporters that he had been desperately searching for his lost boy for years. Then he delivered the fatal strike that Cyrus had written for him. Travis claimed that the feared Ror syndicate had kidnapped his innocent son straight from the freezing Chicago streets. He painted Silas and Harper as wealthy, untouchable monsters hoarding a stolen child for their own twisted gains. The media went absolutely wild, and the story caught fire across the country in a matter of hours. The news anchors demanded immediate justice, and the public outcry threatened to shatter the impenetrable walls of the safe house. Eli stood frozen in the doorway of the living room and watched the broadcast with wide, terrified eyes. The sound of his father's voice hit him like a physical blow and completely shattered the fragile safety he had just begun to feel. He remembered the smell of cheap alcohol and the heavy fists that used to follow that exact same fake, sorrowful tone. His small chest began to heave, and he regressed instantly into a severe panic attack. He backed away from the television, and his knees gave out, dropping him onto the cold marble floor. Harper rushed to his side and wrapped her arms around his shaking shoulders, but Eli was trapped inside his own mind. He believed that Travis was coming to drag him back into the dark and that Silas would be arrested for trying to save him. The toxic guilt swallowed him whole again because the monster on the screen still legally owned him. Silas watched the boy hyperventilate on the floor, and his hands curled into tight, lethal fists. Every instinct in his blood screamed at him to send Miles into the city and silence Travis Carter with a single bullet. He possessed the power to make the lying man disappear into Lake Michigan before the evening news aired. But Silas looked at Harper holding the terrified child, and he realized the brutal truth of the trap. If Travis vanished or turned up dead, the media would instantly convict Silas of murder, and Eli would be thrown into the brutal foster system. Violence would only prove the weeping father right and hand Cyrus the ultimate victory. Silas knelt beside Harper and placed a steady, heavy hand on Eli's trembling back. He looked at his wife and spoke with the cold, absolute certainty of a man changing the rules of the game. "We will not fight them with bullets," Silas declared. "We will drag them into the courtroom and bury them with the truth." The new secure phone buzzed against the marble nightstand like a rattlesnake warning its prey. Eli stared at the glowing screen, and the notification sliced straight through his fragile, recovering heart. It was a message from an unknown number, but the venom in the words belonged to only one man. Travis Carter knew exactly how to bypass billion-dollar security systems because he knew how to exploit the darkest corners of his son's mind. The text was short, and it carried a poison that no doctor could ever extract. The message stated that Travis knew exactly what happened the night Eli's mother died, and he knew it was entirely the boy's fault. Eli read the cruel words, and the air instantly vanished from the massive guest room. The walls of the Chicago safe house seemed to shrink and crush him against the heavy mahogany bed frame. He remembered the blinding rain from 3 years ago and the terrifying sound of shattering glass echoing down the hallway. He remembered running out the front door to find help and leaving her behind with a monster, and he had carried that paralyzing guilt every single day since. His small hands began to shake violently, and he dropped the phone onto the floor like it burned his skin. Eli curled his knees tightly into his chest, and he could not stop the desperate, choking sobs from tearing out of his throat. He truly believed he was a murderer, and that his cowardly decision to run away had sealed his mother's tragic fate. Harper heard the shattered, broken sounds echoing into the hallway, and she pushed open the heavy oak doors without a second of hesitation. She saw the boy rocking on the floor, and she spotted the glowing screen of the dropped phone out of the corner of her eye. She did not need to read the vicious message to know that the ghosts of his past had found a way back in to torment him. Harper dropped to her knees on the expensive rug and pulled his trembling body fiercely against her chest. She did not offer empty platitudes or tell him to simply calm down because street kids know that peace is always a lie. She held him tightly until his hyperventilation finally slowed, and then she made a silent, ironclad promise to sever this invisible chain forever. Harper stood up and walked over to the heavy oak dresser where they had stored the few miserable items recovered from his old street bag. She opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a crumpled, water-stained envelope that Eli had never possessed the courage to open. It was the only thing his mother had managed to slip into his pocket on the night she died. Eli looked at the faded paper, and he shrank back against the bed frame in absolute, paralyzing terror. He was completely convinced that the letter contained her final curse and her bitter disappointment in a cowardly son. Harper did not force the envelope into his hands or demand that he face his darkest demons alone. She sat back down on the floor right beside him, and she smoothed the wrinkled paper with gentle, reverent fingers. She told him that monsters use the truth like a whip to keep their victims running in the dark. But she promised him that real love uses the truth like a shield, and she asked for his quiet permission to read the forbidden words aloud. Eli gave a tiny, terrified nod, and Harper carefully broke the brittle seal on the weathered envelope. She unfolded the fragile paper, and her own eyes immediately filled with hot tears as she read the hurried, slanted handwriting. She kept her voice perfectly steady, and she projected every single syllable into the quiet room so the shadows could not twist them. His mother wrote that she loved him more than life itself, and she begged him to never look back at the violent wreckage she had left behind. She explicitly detailed the terrifying reality of Travis's brutal abuse, and she made it absolutely clear that she was already dying long before Eli ran out the door. The most important line was underlined twice in faded blue ink, and Harper read it with the fierce authority of a judge delivering a final verdict. The letter stated that Eli did not kill her, and surviving a nightmare is never a crime. The beautiful words hung in the air like a holy benediction, and they instantly shattered the psychological chains that Travis had wrapped around his son's throat. Eli let out a jagged, agonizing breath, and the toxic guilt that had poisoned his blood for 3 long years finally drained away. He collapsed against Harper's shoulder, and he cried like a real, vulnerable child for the very first time in his life. He was not crying out of fear or desperation, but from the profound and crushing relief of absolute absolution. Silas appeared silently in the doorway of the guest room, and he watched his wife hold the shattered boy together with nothing but paper and love. The cold Mafia boss did not enter the room or interrupt the sacred, healing moment playing out on the floor. He simply stood guard in the shadows, and his steel-gray eyes softened with a quiet, unbreakable vow. Travis Carter had tried to weaponize the boys' deepest trauma to tear them apart, but the poison had completely failed. The absolute truth had set Eli free, and it forged the three broken survivors into a fiercely loyal, terrifyingly protective family that no enemy could ever hope to break. The physical wounds from the Palos Preserves were still healing, but Silas Ror was ready to strike back. He did not summon his street soldiers or hand out photographs of his enemies to hitmen. He simply walked into the secure office of the Chicago safe house and opened the $1,500 million master ledger. Silas possessed the keys to every shadow bank and offshore account the syndicate had ever built. He moved his fingers across the keyboard and systematically froze the laundered assets that Cyrus and Grant relied on to survive. He choked off their cash flow and canceled their international shipping routes with a few lethal keystrokes. Then he called in massive debts from corrupt politicians and told them that Cyrus was no longer authorized to collect. The financial suffocation was absolute and completely silent. Silas proved that true Mafia power was not measured in bullets, but in the terrifying ability to erase a man's wealth overnight. The traitors had tried to bury him in the dirt, so Silas buried them in numbers instead. Across the city, Grant Harlow felt the invisible noose tighten around his throat within a matter of hours. His mercenary crews demanded their weekly payments, but his accounts were locked and empty. His shell companies collapsed one by one, and the shadow banks refused to return his frantic phone calls. Grant realized that Silas was not reacting like a wounded animal, but dismantling their rebellion with flawless and chilling precision. The desperate panic set in, and Grant knew that Cyrus could not save him without access to the family money. Then the secure line in Grant's office rang with an unexpected summons. It was an invitation from Silas to attend a private peace meeting at the Chicago safe house. Grant falsely believed that Silas was finally willing to negotiate a truce to save the boy from the public media circus. He smoothed his expensive suit and drove straight into the belly of the beast. He had absolutely no idea that Detective Aaron Holt had already wired the main study with concealed police microphones. Grant walked into the mahogany study with a tight, arrogant smile, but the temperature in the room instantly froze his blood. Silas sat behind his massive desk with his hands folded perfectly still. He did not offer Grant a drink or a seat. Silas looked at the traitor with steel gray eyes and began the interrogation with a voice as quiet as a grave. He systematically laid out the massive financial frauds and demanded to know exactly who authorized the surgical removal of the tracking device. Grant tried to bluff and shift the blame onto dead men, but the absolute terror of bankruptcy made his hands shake. Silas leaned forward and looked straight through the traitor. "Tell me you ordered the hit in the woods, and I will unlock your accounts," Silas whispered. The desperate right-hand man cracked under the crushing pressure and the icy silence of the boss. "I hired them to dig the grave, and Cyrus planned the rest," Grant shouted, spilling every poisonous secret because he believed he was trading words for survival. Grant finished his arrogant confession and waited for Silas to transfer the promised funds. But Silas only offered a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach his eyes. The heavy oak doors of the study swung open and Detective Aaron Holt stepped inside with two uniformed officers. Grant stepped back in sheer shock as Holt produced a pair of cold steel handcuffs and read the stunned traitor his rights. The clean cop announced the charges of financial fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder, confirming that every single word had been recorded legally. Grant screamed that Silas was breaking the code of the streets, but the Mafia boss simply turned his chair to watch the winter snow fall outside the window. He had destroyed his greatest enemy without firing a single weapon or breaking a single law. The police dragged the thrashing, broken mercenary out of the safe house and into a waiting squad car. The arrest severed the right hand of the rebellion and left Silas Ror completely isolated in his stolen castle. With Grant sitting in a federal holding cell, Silas Ror realized his invisible empire was bleeding to death. He had lost his right hand and his offshore accounts were frozen solid. He was a desperate predator backed into a corner, and desperate men always make fatal mistakes. He commanded Travis Carter to physically snatch the boy before the official court date could legitimize Silas's custody. Silas and Harper knew the strike was coming, and they coordinated with Detective Aaron Holt to set a flawless and airtight trap. They chose a heavily monitored and brightly lit supermarket parking lot on the north side of Chicago for a fake negotiation. Harper hated the idea of using her son as bait, but she understood that surviving the streets meant you had to draw the monster out into the light. She parked her sleek car under the harsh glare of the sodium lamps and waited for the ghost of Eli's past to arrive. Silas was parked 3 rows away in an unmarked vehicle with his steel-gray eyes fixed on the pavement. The snare was set, and all they needed was for the abusive father to step into the teeth of the trap. Travis Carter pulled into the parking lot in a rusted sedan and slammed the transmission into park. He stepped out into the freezing Chicago wind, and he did not look like the weeping father from the television broadcast. The cameras were gone, and the expensive corporate lawyers were nowhere in sight. He swaggered toward Harper and Eli with the arrogant, heavy footsteps of a man who believed he still owned them. Eli stood frozen beside Harper, and his small hands gripped the hem of her coat like a lifeline. Travis stopped 10 feet away, and his eyes were completely devoid of love or sorrow. He sneered at Harper and demanded she hand over the boy before things got ugly. Harper stood her ground and kept her voice perfectly level so the concealed police microphone could capture every syllable. She asked him if he really cared about the boy or if he just cared about the money Cyrus had promised him. Travis let out a cruel, barking laugh that echoed across the empty asphalt and shattered his public victim narrative forever. Travis took another aggressive step forward and pointed a filthy finger directly at his terrified son. He dropped the grieving father act entirely and began to scream a torrent of vicious and hateful abuse. He told Eli that he was a worthless burden and that he was coming back to the gutter where he belonged. Eli flinched under the weight of the familiar cruelty, but he did not run away this time because he knew his real family was watching. Travis lunged forward and his rough hands clamped down violently onto Eli's thin arm. He yanked the screaming child toward his rusted sedan and threatened to beat him if he did not comply. He bragged loudly that Silas Ror was going to pay him a fortune for delivering the Mafia boss's greatest weakness. Every single horrific word and violent action was captured in pristine high definition by the hidden cameras and the police wire. Travis Carter had just confessed to coercion, child abuse, and attempted kidnapping on a legally sanctioned recording. The trap had reached its breaking point, and the invisible shield around Eli suddenly materialized into cold, hard justice. Before Travis could drag the boy another inch, the dark parking lot erupted in blinding blue and red police lights. Sirens shattered the freezing night air as Detective Holt and 6 uniformed officers swarmed the rusted sedan from every direction. Travis froze in absolute shock, and his grip on Eli's arm instinctively loosened. Harper moved with blinding speed and ripped her son away from the monster, pulling him safely behind her own body. Holt drew his service weapon, and his voice cut through the chaos with absolute, uncompromising authority. He ordered Travis to drop to his knees and interlace his fingers behind his head. The abusive father realized he had been completely outplayed, and he collapsed onto the frozen asphalt in total defeat. The officers slammed heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists and dragged him toward the waiting cruiser. The weeping victim from the evening news was exposed as a violent fraud for the entire world to see. Silas watched from the shadows as the squad car drove away, knowing the final obstacle between his family and freedom had just been erased. The Chicago courtroom was cold and sterile, but the air felt heavy with the weight of a final reckoning. Travis Carter sat at the plaintiff's table with his expensive corporate lawyers, but he was sweating and trembling under the harsh fluorescent lights. He tried to maintain his grieving father facade, but the parking lot arrest had already shattered his mask. Harper and Silas sat on the other side of the aisle with Eli placed safely between them like a shielded king. Detective Aaron Holt took the stand, and he did not bring rumors or Mafia mythology to the judge. He brought cold, undeniable facts and a legally sanctioned audio recording that he played for the entire room to hear. Travis's vicious screams and abusive threats echoed off the wood-paneled walls and completely obliterated the carefully crafted media circus. Hull presented the airtight financial trails that proved Silas Ror had funded the entire extortion plot to buy a child's life. The high-priced lawyers collapsed under the crushing weight of absolute proof, and the judge looked down from the bench with absolute disgust. The courtroom fell into a deafening silence when the judge finally turned his severe gaze toward the 12-year-old boy. He asked Eli directly what he wanted and where he felt he truly belonged. Eli did not shake, and he did not hide behind Harper's coat like a frightened stray anymore. He stood up tall in the center of the room, and he looked straight past the man who had terrorized his entire childhood. He pointed to Harper and Silas, and his voice rang out clear and unbreakable. He declared that he wanted to stay with the protective monsters who actually kept him safe when the rest of the world looked away. The judge nodded slowly and brought the heavy wooden gavel down with the finality of a thunderclap. He officially terminated Travis's parental rights forever and granted full, legal custody to Harper and Silas Ror. The toxic chains of Eli's past were permanently severed by the law, and he was finally free to claim the family he deserved. At that exact same moment, the final embers of the rebellion were being violently extinguished across the city. Silas Ror stood on the freezing docks of a Chicago shipping port, desperately trying to board a freighter to flee the country. He clutched a leather briefcase that he believed contained the billion-dollar master ledger, but federal agents swarmed him from the shadows. The FBI slapped cold steel handcuffs onto the untouchable uncle and opened the briefcase to find only a worthless stack of decoy papers. Silas had orchestrated the perfect checkmate and erased his greatest enemy without spilling a single drop of blood. Miles drove the dark SUV back to the fortified estate, and the massive iron gates rolled open to welcome them. Eli stepped out onto the pristine driveway, and he did not look over his shoulder for the ghosts of the streets. He walked through the towering front doors of the mansion, finally home. This story proves that family is rarely defined by the blood in your veins, but by the people who bleed to keep you safe. Eli was a discarded street kid who saved a monster, and in return, he found a mother and a father who tore the world apart to protect him. Harper and Silas chose the difficult path of restraint and justice because true power is fighting for the people you love without losing your soul. We hope this intense journey touched your heart and reminded you that unconditional love can heal the deepest trauma. Thank you for spending your time with us here at Sunni Romance. Have you ever found your true family in the most unexpected places? We would love to read your thoughts in the comments below, and we will see you in the next story.